Good afternoon. It's 1:33. So let's start and continue texting, telling your friends to come over and be here. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Sub-Theme 3, the last plenary of PMAC 2026. My name is Tuba, and I'm your host for today's sessions. Now they say to save the best for last, while some of my peer moderators for other plenaries may raise their eyebrows. But here we are. Everyone would agree that these sections is where big, messy, contentious issues converge. Climate change, planetary health, geopolitics, AI, and youth voices. We basically roll the overarching themes of the past few PMACs into this epic sub-theme. And I have a good news and a bad news. Now let's start with the good news. We have assembled 6 stellar speakers and a brilliant keynote for you. So you are in for a high energy, tight curated ride that aims to provoke, frame, and inspire. Yes, and after these very tricky post-lunch slots. Now the bad news is that this session isn't a full movie. It is a trailer. I have less than 60 minutes to navigate through the most complex issues of our times. And let's be honest, that's not enough. So I'm going to break PMAC traditions, asking for your sympathy, and say this up front. There won't be Q&A. I know. But I promise that you will walk away from these sessions with better questions. Hold on to these very, very good questions. Go to our parallel sections for deep dives where you have ample time to interact with our speakers and exchange ideas. And this conversation doesn't end here. It evolves from here. So the trailer has 3 chapters. The first one is a science framing. Big picture, big data. The second chapter is on ground truths, real stories from the front lines. And the third one is on financing, who pays and how. And this topic has, you've heard through side events, special sessions on Wednesday, and also in the previous 2 sub-themes. Now here, let's talk power, global solidarity in a splintered world. So buckle up and let's dive in. To kick us off, Professor Sir Andrew Haynes, one of the most respected voices in planetary health. He's a professor of environmental change and public health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, a pioneer in connecting the dots between climate, health, and systems transformation. Unfortunately, he's only here with us virtually to help us zoom out, make sense of the chaos, and remind us what's at stake. Let's roll Andy's keynote.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak, and I'm really sorry I can't be with you in person. But what I'd like to do in about 10 minutes is to share some reflections on the poly crisis, which I think is confronting humanity, and say something about the challenges, but also the opportunities for responses, including the implications for global governance, really in the hope that stimulate discussion and debate in the session that follows. So the first slide, I think, is self-explanatory and really just shows you how temperatures have been increasing across the surface of the Earth and represents, of course, the effects of the accumulation of greenhouse gases and other climate-active pollutants that have caused the global average temperature to exceed 1.5 degrees in 2024, and it looks as though 2025 is going to be probably the 3rd hottest year on record as well. We are confronted by unprecedented temperature changes, which are having impacts on health around the world. And at the same time, we're also confronted by increasing conflicts and militarism, which are compounding many of the global environmental problems. So climate change obviously is the environmental threat that's really most in the public mind, but of course it's just one of a number of global environmental changes exemplified by the planetary boundaries framework. And this slide summarizes really how this has evolved over the last 15, 16 years or so. You can see in 2009, this original groundbreaking work by Rockstrom and colleagues suggested that there were 7 planetary boundaries, of which 3 had already been crossed. And then you can see how this has evolved over recent years. And now, the most recent analysis, which includes 9 planetary boundaries, including issues like novel entities, like chemical pollutants, and a range of other boundaries, fresh water, land use change, biogeochemical flows, ocean acidification, and so on. 7 of these have been crossed. So the only 2 that haven't been crossed are stratospheric ozone depletion, which of course has been stabilized by the phasing out of CFCs, and atmospheric aerosol loading. Although even there, of course, if we take the human health impacts of atmospheric aerosol loading, in other words, air pollution, then we know already that there are many millions of people being killed every year by ambient air pollution. So these are very major changes indeed to the global environment, and they have profound implications for human health. Some of these are still being studied and are uncertain, but we know enough to know that these are going to undermine the foundations of much of the health that we've experienced, the growth and increase in health that we've experienced over recent decades. Just to give you one example, the frequency of climate disasters experienced in a lifetime for a person born in 2020 compared to one born in 1960, profound increases, really, very major increases. 7.5 times as many heat waves, over 3.5 times as many droughts, 3 times as many crop failures, double the number of wildfires, and nearly 3 times as many river floods. So really a big acceleration in the number of climate disasters. And of course, it's not just obvious disasters that are important for human health, but also the gradual change in temperature exposes more and more people to extreme heat. And that has implications for human health, not just for increasing death rates amongst the elderly, but also, for example, effects on child development, on maternal health, increasing premature labour risks and others. So a real diversity of health effects ranging from non-communicable to communicable diseases, and of course encompassing mental health impacts as well. At the same time, we're also seeing this increase in conflicts. And of course, there are interrelationships between environmental change and conflict risks. They're complex, they're not just simple linear relationships, but there are a range of pathways by which climate change, and perhaps some of the other environmental changes as well, could affect the risk of conflict through the impacts on the economy, causing volatile markets, high prices, increasing crisis cycles, obviously a lack of access to environmental resources, increasing poverty, for example, with climate change, increasing temperatures make it more difficult to work in the open, therefore reduce income for the poorest, reduce crop yield for subsistence farmers and so on. And all of this adds up to a sort of two-way relationship, increasing the risk, the drivers of conflict. Not a simple linear relationship, as I've mentioned, but I think there's emerging reasonably good evidence that there are interlinkages between these two burgeoning challenges to global development. So we've seen an unprecedented rise in global military expenditure, which you can see on this slide. You can see that in 2024, global military expenditure increased to $2.7 trillion, or just over. The 10th year of consecutive rises in military expenditure, and probably 2025 is going to be even higher. Also, and it's not, I think, coincidental, we've seen a number of countries with net debt outflows doubling over the last decade, so that increasingly the flows of Previously, there were positive flows of aid. These are now reversing on a global scale, and you can see that increasing number of low middle income countries are affected by these negative transfers, and they're finding it more and more difficult to service their public debt. And of course, the interest payments for low middle income countries are much higher than for high income countries because there's a greater probability of them defaulting, of course. And this interesting, I think, powerful quote from Dwight Eisenhower is not an obvious kind of ally in this area, but I think really a very powerful quote from him, making the point that every gun is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who are hunger and are not fed, and so on. So a powerful statement. And I think that summarizes one of the interlinkages between climate change, environmental change and conflict. It can amplify the impacts, possibly also be a trigger for conflict, and also means it's much more difficult for countries to adapt to climate change when they're affected by conflict situations. And of course, we know that the adaptation funding going to conflict affected countries tends to be less, although they certainly need that funding. And it's still possible to create reasonable adaptation responses as long as you consult local communities and so on. The other issue that's really, I think, coming to public awareness in recent years is the potentially rising risk of nuclear war. On the right here, you can see the so-called doomsday clock, which is in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, which is a kind of qualitative assessment of risks, of course, and you can always debate whether it's how accurate or not it is, but it is a very considered opinion by a group of very well-informed people. And you can see how the doomsday clock symbolizes really the risks of closer to midnight, the closer the world would be to potential disaster. And you can see, if you look back a few decades, we were well away from midnight, but in recent years we've got increasingly closer. And we're now 89 seconds to midnight. At the end of January this year, the bulletin will be announcing its latest assessment. So because of the increasing tensions between various states, you can see that the risks are increasing. Although the number of nuclear weapons has declined since the Cold War, and they're shown on the left side of the slide, there are very large numbers of weapons still in existence. And we know that about 2,000 of those warheads are on the alert, and they can be launched at very short notice. So that is a risk. That's a risk that's possibly even greater than some of the risks during the Cold War, because some of these weapons can be launched very rapidly. And of course, there are other risks like the advent of AI and so on, the vulnerability of satellites, which also arguably compound the risks. And also the creation of anti-missile defences, which actually can't defend us from nuclear attack, but also can ratchet up the tensions. So for all these reasons, I think it's plausible to think that there would increasing risk of nuclear war. And we cannot avoid that. We need to consider how best to address that. And I've recently been asked to be the vice chair of the UN panel on nuclear war effects. And we'll be looking over the next year and a half or so in great detail at the potential effects of nuclear war. And hopefully this will raise the public profile of nuclear war and get negotiations restarted again, because nuclear disarmament negotiations, as you know, have ceased to actually occur, and we need to bring them back on track. So in concluding, let me just ask, well, what actually can we do to address some of these compound challenges to humanity, the future of humanity? And looking back to the Lancet Planetary Health Commission, which I had the honour to chair 10 years ago now, we identified three major challenges. One was the imagination challenge, or conceptual challenge, of conceptualizing a world in which health and equity was prioritised within planetary boundaries. The second was of developing sufficient knowledge to make these changes. And there's a lot that we do know about how to live. We know that we have to phase out fossil fuel energy, and a whole host of other policies need to be brought into play. But one of the issues is that we're not implementing the knowledge that we have in sufficient speed. And much of the knowledge that we do have is somewhat theoretical. So it comes from modelling exercises rather than evaluating implemented actions. So we need to move much more towards the evaluation of implemented actions, learning by doing, and minimizing the trade-offs and so on. And importantly, I think we need to reconceptualize security. We need to redefine security in this epoch, which has been called the Anthropocene by many, and recognize that can't be just achieved by more and more expenditure on the military and more nuclear weapons. We need to safeguard health within planetary boundaries. So we need to think about planetary health as an overarching framework for our security in the Anthropocene. We've tried to address this in our book a few years ago. So what are the opportunities? Well, they're very major ones. If, for example, just taking climate mitigation actions, if we could implement cross-sectoral policies, these could prevent millions of premature deaths worldwide each year, as we've documented in our Pathfinder Initiative Climate and Health Evidence Bank, over 5 million deaths a year from potentially preventable from fossil fuel burning, if we phase that out. Several million deaths a year, different estimates really, but most of them suggest several million deaths a year from physical inactivity and active travel, active transport, public transport, affordable public transport, rather than over-dependence on the private car, could address some of those, some of that challenge of physical inactivity. And then if you look at the most recent Eat Lancet report, they suggest around 15 million deaths, premature deaths annually, could be prevented by shifting towards healthier diets, which also have a much lower environmental footprint on the climate, of course, on nitrogen and phosphorus flows, on land use change, biodiversity loss, and so on. So big potential benefits from implementing these much more sustainable policies across sectors, but using health as an important motivator for accelerating implementation. And we have to get over this dichotomy between mitigation and adaptation. These are two rather different communities. Some people emphasize the need to adapt to the climate change we can't prevent. Obviously, that's important, but we also need to cut emissions. So we need to integrate these policies as rapidly as we can. And one of the ways we can do that is through increasing nature-based solutions like reforestation, sustaining biodiversity, green urban infrastructure, and so on. And also, it's very striking that the amount of money that we're spending on arms, over $2.5 trillion a year, is roughly the amount that emerging markets and developing countries, excluding China, need to meet their climate goals. So if we could divert some of that military funding to actually addressing the real security challenges of our age, that would bring multiple benefits. Obviously, how we do that is something for discussion. So let me conclude by just saying that positive environmental and health framing bolsters public support for climate policies, and no doubt other policies as well. It's still possible to stay well under 2 degrees, even if we're going to breach the 1.5 degree climate limit. If we reduce all the greenhouse gases, the CO2, the methane, other greenhouse gases and short-lived climate pollutants. But a number of studies have shown how emphasizing these health and environmental benefits can bolster public support, even potentially amongst those individuals that are unconcerned about climate change or don't see it as a major priority. So in conclusion then, we have really, I think, a historical challenge, a historical choice between us, confronting us over the next few years. And that means that we have this choice between transformative changes and business as usual. And as we know at the moment, we're being pushed back towards business as usual because of the pushback against fossil fuel phase out, for example. But there's still the potential for transformative changes that would push us on a much more sustainable footing. And that, it seems to me, is what we must aim towards over coming years. And that will require changes in power relationships, of course. It will require internalization of those external costs of fossil fuel burning and unsustainable food systems, changing knowledge structures which emphasize the importance of rapid synthesis of knowledge, evaluation of implemented actions, and challenging values that are based primarily only really on economic growth and not on distribution or not on sustaining our economy within planetary boundaries. And this final slide really is a nice infographic taken from Ilona Otto's paper a few years ago. in which she emphasizes the importance of identifying tipping points for rapid transformational change. I think you're probably familiar with negative tipping points by which climate change can rapidly cause disruption of these vital Earth systems, for example, collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet or collapse of the Amazon basin ecosystem and so on. But there may also be positive tipping points, and that's what we need to go for now. Understanding the opportunities and benefits of change, evaluating and catalysing the uptake of policies. Obviously, healthcare is important because it's 5% of emissions and also contributes to other planetary boundaries or the breaching of them. But it needs to go beyond healthcare. It needs to mobilise other sectors that influence health as well. And that final part of the slide on the right side shows us that because of social complexities, we may actually experience quite a lot of turbulence, which I think is what we're experiencing at the moment. That's not a reason for giving up. That's a reason for doubling down on these actions and really for looking at ways in which we can accelerate action towards a healthy, sustainable and peaceful future. Thank you very much indeed.
The risks are compounding faster than our systems can cope, but the science is clear. The window for action is still open. Let's thank again Professor Haynes with a warm round of applause across the time zones. Now I would like to invite our panelists to the stage. Professor Raya Mutarak, Hilayun Suryuantai Brayun, Alana Nichols, Garbielal, and John Patterson.
Yes.
Thank you. Our next speaker is someone who brings in both brains and boldness to these conversations. Raya Mutarak, Professor of Demography at University of Bologna, Italy. She's also a TED speaker on how climate change affects population dynamics and serves on the UN High-Level Advisory Board for Economic and Social Affairs. Raya sits exactly at that intersections where evidence meets actions and where data challenges power. Raya, building on Andy's framing, what are the most compelling recent findings from your research? And what do you think the data is telling policymakers that they haven't fully absorbed?
Thanks, Tuba. You're saying that I could stand up as well, right? So just to wake everyone up, wake myself up as well.
Sure.
Right, so I want to extend, thanks for the question, and I want to extend a little bit to what Andy was saying, that all of this crisis that we're experiencing now, so not only climate change, but also conflict and other things are already affecting demographic behaviors, which are fertility, mortality, and migration. And these are the demographic components that underlie demographic transition. So bringing back a little bit to the topic of this conference. So any population-related policy thinking about the future, because we know that the global temperature, unfortunately, will continue to rise. And if we know that climate change affects these demographic behaviors, so we have to really think about what to do, right? Because it affects how we think about fertility policy, how we think about migration policy, and so on. So I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to focus a bit more on migration. But of course, in our work, we also have shown there's a strong, consistent evidence showing that exposure to heat, we find a short-term reduction in fertility. And this applies to low-income countries, middle-income countries, and even high-income countries like Italy, Spain, and France as well. In terms of mortality, we already hear that climate change affects health. And It is estimated actually that exposure to extreme temperatures, so be it the cold one or the hot one, it contributes to about 5 million deaths annually, globally, right? But some countries will benefit from it actually. So countries like the cold countries, so when you think about Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, for instance, they would benefit from reduction in mortality from cold days. But moving forward into the future, as I said, that the global temperature will continue to rise. In the middle of the century, so because it's getting hotter, so heat-related mortality is going to replace the cold-related mortality. So we're going to see actually the increase in excess mortality due to heat. So this is to highlight again that climate change can be behind the driver of affecting the demographic transition we're talking about. Now I'm going to come back to migration that I was saying. Living in Europe, one of the questions that the policymakers like to ask us is, would climate change increase mass migration? And if so, where are they coming? Where are they going? Are they going to go to Europe? And I have 5 minutes in my talk, so I just say no. We don't have enough evidence. What we observe that there wouldn't be climate change wouldn't lead into mass international migration into Europe based on the current evidence that we have. So I want to emphasize a little bit that probably, because most of the climate-related migration is actually going to be short distances and within the country. So this is strong evidence that we find. So that I can confirm that. And another thing I want to highlight is that probably we should move away slightly from this kind of complexity that we always think that climate change would lead to mass migration, to think about the people who may want to leave or who may need to leave, but they cannot leave. So this is called trapped population. So people who are vulnerable, they may have a need to leave, but they don't have the resources to do so. Some of you, or many of us, I'm a migrant too, because I come from Thailand, now I currently live in Italy. Migration is a costly process. You need to have some financial resources, social networks, to kind of enable you to support your migration movement. And in fact, we actually do find that people from low-income households are less likely to move as compared to people with higher-income households. I'm going to end quite soon, so I just want to talk about another thing that we dig further into, actually, who is likely to move when they get exposed to climate change. So my recent work, we look at intention to migrate abroad permanently in 150 countries. And we find that actually, so this thing of compound risk that we have heard, so if people get exposed to conflict, about 20% say that they would like to leave their own country. But when they get exposed also to drought, so amplifying, right? So the interaction between drought and conflict, now it's 50%, 45% of them. So almost half of them, 1 in 2 would want to move. So this is to show that drought can amplify the effect of conflict. And then those who are more likely to say that they want to move are women and those who are less educated. So this is intention to migrate. But when we look at who actually migrate, actually they are not women and not the lower educated ones. So this is come back again to say that maybe they wish to migrate, but they cannot. So I'm going to end here by emphasizing that the impact of climate change is not affecting everyone in the same way, and the capacity to adapt, such as using migration or other means as an adaptation, would vary between population subgroups, and the policy may want to target the vulnerable populations. Thank you.
Thanks, Rhea. And please join Rhea in parallel section 3.1 on climate change. And also we have one parallel section on migration if you wanted to unpack this issue further. Now let's move to our part 2, which is the ground truth. Real stories from the front lines. What governance looks like when you are managing real constraints. It is both timely and fitting that we now turn to Thailand, a country that has long served as a bridge between national policy and regional cooperation in health, particularly in the context of mobility, migration, and humanitarian response. We honored to be joined by Kun Suryawan Thaiprayun, Deputy Director of Global Health Division, Ministry of Public Health. And as many of us in this room already know, October 1st, 2025, Thailand enacted a landmark policy allowing Myanmar refugees in 9 border shelters across 4 provinces to legally access work opportunities. Now, this is a significant shift that reflects both pragmatism and compassion. Thailand also continued to strengthen its role with regional health diplomacy, including through ASEAN frameworks. Kun Suri, what lessons can be drawn from Thailand's experience to inform ASEAN's future efforts towards inclusive, resilient, and regionally coherent health systems?
Thank you. It's a very tough question. And when we talk about the migrants, displaced person, so the topic seems not welcoming. But Thailand has done some great jobs that we can share some lessons to ASEAN member states. As you mentioned earlier, that Thailand hosts millions of migrants, mainly from Myanmar, Cambodia, maybe no longer Cambodia, and Laos. Many works in informal sectors. Many are undocumented. So we are not worried if they are documented because they are entitled to health insurance scheme under the Social Security scheme and also American health insurance. But for those who are undocumented, the most worrying issues because it's very hard to find them where they are. And just last year, we come up with the innovative health insurance we call HINT. HINT, H-I-N-T. It stands for Health Insurance for Non-Thai. So now we open the online platform that undocumented migrants can buy insurance online so that they can access to essential medical treatment and also health screening for communicable diseases. And for this first person that you just mentioned earlier, yes, some of them living in we call temporary shelters. We don't prefer calling refugee camps. So some of them live there for almost 4 decades, maybe longer than 4 decades, receiving humanitarian aid from donor countries. And just last year, and humanitarian aid also support the health service program in the temporary shelters. Just last year, that the donor sent us the warning message that humanitarian aid will no longer exist sooner or later. And then this just alert the Thai government to find the solution, how we can accommodate this situation. So we, at the Ministry of Public Health, just together with the other line ministry and colleagues, I saw some familiar faces here that joined several rounds of consultation, how we can find both immediate solution and long-term solution to accommodate this situation. So very fortunate that in August last year, the Thai government took a bold decision for the first time in the past 4 decades, come up with the significant policy change to allow Myanmar displaced persons to work outside the temporary shelters. We have 9 temporary shelters located along the Thai-Myanmar border. So there are almost, I don't remember the exact number, maybe around 80,000 people living in the camp. Then they are allowed to work, but we have some specific measure and protocol how we implement that resolution from the cabinet. So this policy change also aim at addressing labor shortages and reducing reliance on humanitarian aid. So for the provider service, we also implement we call migrant inclusive health system. We know that language is a main barrier when it comes to the health facility. So we also provide interpretation services, and we train migrant health volunteers. We let people talk to their own people so that we can overcome this barrier. We also have the Migrant Learning Center in Tak or Mesot provinces that we can build capacity for migrant health volunteer there. So within the time, I cannot cover several challenges that we are facing, and just would like to illustrate the importance of the inclusiveness of health policy and expansion of the universal health coverage that include migrants and non-Thai citizens. So at least I think 3 lessons that we can draw from this and offer to the ASEAN health cooperation in the next phase. So the first one is about the inclusive. The first one I should give the credit to the government, so the political commitment referring to the cabinet decision in August last year. And the second one is inclusive health policy and expansion of universal health coverage. And ASEAN can promote health financing framework that allow mobile and non-citizen population to be systematically included in national system across ASEAN. And the last one, and the most important one, I think we should exit from the culture of dependency. I'm talking about the foreign assistance. So we need to invest in health system strengthening in our region. So I know that ASEAN is in the process of finalizing health cooperation priorities. So as the ASEAN region is vulnerable to climate change impact, and also we also experience this with the double burden disease as well, in addition to geopolitical tension. So ASEAN need to work together toward health system threat ready and work in solidarity to promote inclusive and resilient health system using its own resources. Thank you.
Thanks. Congratulations to the Thai government and Thai people. And let's keep this spirit up. Now, from the regional systems, we now go to one of the toughest governance environments, fragility and conflict. Healer is a founder of Afghan Youth Ambassadors for Peace Organizations, bringing lived and professional experience from Afghanistan. She's a kind of peace builder who turns UN resolutions into real-world practice. Hila, can you share a story that captures what governing health looks like under pressure, and one practical shift that would most improve dignity and access, especially for women and young people?
Thank you. I want to start with a story that lives inside every Afghan home. 2 brothers grew up in the same Afghan home. One joined an extremist group, the other worked with the government fighting the group. They met on the battlefield, both killed each other. The same imam who recited prayer in their ears have led their funeral on the same. They were buried next to each other. Their graves are literally next to each other. And the person left behind was their mother, already a widow, with no education, no income, and decades of war in her body. The mother is often the missing line in many policy memos. She's the outcome of polycrisis, conflict, poverty, displacement, gender inequality, trauma stacked on top of each other. And if you work in public health, you already know what comes next. There's chronic stress, depression, malnutrition, infectious diseases, maternal health complication, and collapse in trust in institution. So for me, when we started Afghan Youth Ambassador for Peace Organization and later MOSCA, the question was, how do we stop crisis earlier before the burden becomes grief and displacement and long life illness? When we started Afghan Youth Ambassador, we began because young people in fragile contexts is often treated like audience. We're usually invited to a panel discussion because we add a touch of diversity and young energy, but we are never funded to deliver. Youth are mostly considered a side issue in many conflict-affected countries, but also in many developing countries as well. But they often forget that youth are the system that needs support. Our work in Afghanistan, especially with IAPO, is quite simple. We work on prevention and cohesion, not just responses. Community dialogue that is not performative, psychosocial support that is culturally grounded, youth-led project that rebuild trust at the local level. Because when trust drops, everything gets more expensive. Vaccination uptake, maternal care, disaster response, all of it becomes expensive when there is no trust in the institution. Later on, we've created Muska, which is a digital mobile application health that provides basic mental health services in Afghanistan. And we created Muska because health inequity and often is an access problem. It's not an awareness problem. In Afghanistan and many crisis settings, mental health support is blocked mainly by three things. It's cost, stigma, and safety. If a young woman cannot travel safely, she cannot reach care. If she cannot pay, she cannot study to care. If seeking support puts her reputation at risk, she will not even start accessing mental health support. So we built Muska because it's reachable, it's low barrier support, and basic mental health well-being tools are available, and simple guidance and pathways to local services where possible. We are also building a practical crisis feature like a blood donor directory and also an immunization alert system as well in Afghanistan, but this can be led to implement in many other countries as well. Because in fragile setting, health system can mean a family desperately reaching for matching blood type at 2 a.m. We wanted to build a technology that reaches everyone with dignity, not with the delay. And the lesson learned we have first is fund prevention like you're funding responses, create flexible, rapid funding windows for youth-led and women-led organizations. We only started Muska with $2,000, and we are struggling to get funding because we come from a fragile context. And funding that takes weeks, not quarters, because in poly crisis, slow money means no money. And second, measure what matters. For the past 3 days in these conferences, we have seen so many slides and matrix all the time about different data and stuff. But what's missing is what matter and who has the power when it comes to implementing health supports in conflict systems. If those two things improve, time and power, that's when health equity also improves. And the last thing is that if you're working on technology, AI, and health, build a technology that protects the dignity of those who are receiving it as well. And if you take anything from the story I've shared or the work we do, it's one thing that we don't need more sympathy for the grieving mother. What we need is that is working on system that's producing those mothers. And this means investing earlier, designing with women and young people, and treat trust as a core public health asset. We are at the last day of this conferences, and one thing I want to address as well that we've talked about so many crises in the world. We talked about research, policy, and what happens in this type of setting is that we create a bubble. Because most often we only speak to other experts. We speak to public health practitioners, we speak to other policymakers. And for the past 3 days, we've been doing that. What happens is that when one thing we have not touched upon is the epidemic of apathy that is being created within ourselves as well. There's genocides happening. There's many women and girls in different countries, and Afghanistan especially don't have access to school. But we're becoming very normalized to these things that are happening. We're having these panel discussions, receptions happening, networking. And one thing that we should address that what thing we have normalized and what type of bubble we're creating. I think this is a recommendation coming from me as well as that whenever we're creating this type of system, make it victim-centered as well. Bring the people who are facing these crises because you need to hear their stories, you need to hear their realities on the ground. And that's really important because sometimes we can go post our pictures on LinkedIn that we have attended conferences, put Instagram stories. We can do all of that. We can network, meet other people, but at the same time, when you're leaving this conference, take one actionable step to actually support those people who are facing climate crisis. And that would be my last recommendation for everyone in this audience, that if you're a public health, if you're a donor or a funder, when you're leaving these conferences, what one action you can take to help those who are displaced, who are facing mental health crisis, and not just another conference where we just produce some impact stories and another resolution that's still at the UN headquarters or at these international conferences, but never reaches at the local level. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. Thanks for the powerful story and an honest observation. We will take it all in. And you've reminded us that in the fragile context, governance isn't abstract. It's about survival, dignity, and who steps up when the formal systems fail. Let's move to our next speaker. We turn to someone who spent the last 2 decades trying to make those systems work better. John Patterson, Chief of Program and Contracts at World Vision Australia. His leadership spans international development, humanitarian operations, and partnership. He has led crisis response with USAID in Afghanistan, Gaza, Armenia, Azerbaijan. John, what if the challenge isn't lack of compassion, but a failure of financial design? Can you share an innovation that reimagines how aid works so poor households aren't left to absorb shocks alone?
Thank you. Thanks, Tuba. It's such an important question, and I think for many of us in the international aid sector, it is the question of the moment. And I like the way that you framed it and coming off of what you mentioned. And I think it's really important to state very clearly up front that this disruption that we're seeing now is not a crisis of compassion. I understand why it can look that way and feel that way. When we see governments step away from international commitments, when we see needs rise and budgets drop, it can start to feel like compassion is disappearing. And for someone like myself who have spent their whole career in the international space and looking at it, from different lenses, from defense, civil service, humanitarian action, and through those experiences come to believe very, very firmly that good development policy is good foreign policy. To see what is happening is disheartening. But I think in this moment it is important for us all to remind ourselves that USAID did not invent compassion. And neither did the European Union or GIZ or JICA or any of the UN agencies or INGOs, not even World Vision. We did not invent human compassion. We responded to it. We were inspired and moved to action because of it, not the other way around. And I think throughout human history, we have cared about each other and failed each other. But the best and the worst of who we are has never depended on government budgets. And it won't this time either. We will find new ways. We will innovate. One of these new ways at World Vision is through a program called Climate Cash Plus. This is a new generation of parametric climate insurance. There is no loss damage assessments, no post-disaster claims to file. Instead, there is a predetermined set of objective weather data that triggers rapid cash payments, sometimes even before impacts have peaked, so that families can have liquidity when it matters most. Healthcare shocks are also very devastating, and the harsh truth is that the poorest households in the world are paying for healthcare. They are just doing it at the worst possible moment and at the highest possible cost. And so at World Vision, we ask not how can we subsidize healthcare, but what does truly affordable and dignified health coverage look like? And the answer that we have come up with is radically affordable health insurance that is locally based. It utilizes telemedicine, hospital coverage, life benefits, injury benefits, and it is designed in a way to make sure that illness does not become irreversible poverty. So I do think the sector is changing. Obviously, the sector is changing. It's not going to look like what it did before. We're going to have to find new ways of operating. We're going to have to find new policies. We're going to have to find new ways to resource those operations. But I firmly believe we will, because despite what our politicians say, I do think we still care about each other.
Thanks, John. And that's a perfect segue into our final part of these conversations: finance, giving, and the future architecture. And I know that you've heard a lot since Monday, our special sessions on Wednesday, and the previous two sub-themes have touched upon this. You also heard from Gabriel in Plenary 00. But first, I'd like to introduce a person who comes from outside the traditional global health stage, but this is exactly what PMAC want to see and bring in. Alana, CEO of ProPurpose, represents a movement that built on the idea that millions of small, medium enterprises, yes, you heard me, small, medium enterprises, can be a part of systemic solutions. So Alana, you can tell us more about ProPurpose, but I remember in the conversation you did mention that generosity is really about how to be generous well, not just giving. Can you share what it looks like to design generosity well that enables the shift at scale?
Great. Well, thank you. Before I share and explain how to design generosity well, I'd love to start by sharing why it matters. So I am the offspring of a sponsored child. I don't know whether you've ever met anyone like me, the next generation of a sponsored child, but I am living proof that intentional generosity can create lasting generational change, the type of impact that truly transforms lives. So here in the room today, who has ever had the privilege of visiting a beautiful country in the Pacific of Fiji? Hands up, who's been to Fiji? Bula, that's how we say hello in Fiji. Now your turn, everyone. Bula? No, you've got to do it the big Fijian smile. Bula! Bula. Thank you. So in the 1960s, my dad was a young Fijian boy growing up on the islands. He was one of 8 children, extremely poor, living under a tin roof shack in the local village. He often would cry himself to sleep at night as he was going to bed on an empty stomach because his mother was still out on the reef trying to catch fish for dinner. And then one day, everything changed. There was a couple from Australia who hopped off a cruise ship and landed in Suva, Fiji. As they walked off the boat, they came across a young boy, my dad, who was there engraving tourist names in wooden souvenirs. They were drawn right in by his huge Fijian smile. They started and sparked a conversation, and in that moment they chose to pay for his entire high school education. Just like that, a young boy in poverty was placed into the best boarding school in Fiji. He was given an opportunity to flourish. And so this couple, Mr. and Mrs. Moon, their intentional generosity, month in, month out, year in, year out, paid for his school education, then into a building trade in carpentry. He found himself in Australia, he fell in love, built a family and built a business. I'm literally here chatting with you today. I'm here on this planet because a couple chose to be generous to a young boy who had a young girl who now leads the ProPurpose movement, uniting 70,000 small and medium enterprises to create $1 billion in social impact by 2035. It's a revolution in generosity. You know, to design generosity well moves away from transactional charity to a more deeply rooted and meaningful way of aligning profit with purpose. It's moving away from giving to charity, but actually looking at how small and medium businesses can leverage resources to create lasting transformation and scaled social impact together. You know, to fund social impact and social need and the systemic change we need to see across this world, the SMEs are this untapped and overlooked force. So often international aid organisations, health organisations will look to government and will look to high net worth individuals or large corporations. But in Australia, there is this movement emerging of small and medium enterprises that are coming together collectively and creating scaled impact. The opportunity is huge. In Australia, SMEs count for 99.8% of all businesses. They employ 70% of Australia's workforce. They raise $500 billion in revenue each year. It's 1/3 of the nation's GDP. So to harness this potential, generosity needs to be designed in a framework that's intentional, that's credible, that's simplified, and that is collective. When it comes to intentional, it needs to be it needs to be generosity that is with purpose. It's connected to a business's existence. Why do they exist? What do they value? Not being transactional charity, ad hoc donations, but rather embedded into business as usual. When it comes to credible, it's about partnering with trusted, vetted charity partners so that businesses know that their impact is real. The impact is tracked and measured so that businesses have impact stories to share with their team, with their clients and other stakeholders. When it comes to simplified, it's how to make generosity seamless so that busy business leaders can embed generosity in social impact as business as usual. And finally, it needs to be collective, that together we can do wonderful things. As small businesses often, and that's why I think they've been overlooked, because by themselves they can only do so much, but there's this power in coming together in collective impact to truly scale. And when people come together on purpose, they feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. They feel like they belong. That is the fabric of revolutions that actually work. And so we are right now at this place of we are really ripe for mobilising, where there's, on one hand, you have so much social need that is needed across our globe, but on the other hand, you have statistics and research that shows that the businesses that will thrive in the future are those that have a purpose beyond profit. So now's the time where really we can work together to unite these two realities and unlock a new way forward. So let's accelerate this revolution in generosity together.
Thank you. It is a real shift in how to unlock the power of small actors to drive big change. I know it is time, but don't look at the clock yet because we started a bit later. So please stay with us. And our next speaker is Professor Gabriela, as one of Asia's most influential public health leaders, the longest-serving Dean of Medicine at the University of Hong Kong. But what you might not know about him, he's also a trained conductor, someone who spent years bringing youth orchestra into harmony. And that's exactly what he's doing now at Institute of Philanthropy, orchestrating alignment between science, public systems, and catalytic capital to deliver real impact. Gabriel, can Asia's emerging philanthropies lead a new wave of climate health investments, combining cultural traditions, regional capital, and catalytic risk-taking to build a system that protects both people and the planet?
Thank you, Tuba. I know that I stand between you and your next session or tea break, so I shall try to be brief. But above all, I need to be honest with you. This is not a very good time to be relying on philanthropic capital, especially for something as complex as Andy Haynes laid out at the beginning, prefacing this panel. And here are the reasons. First, there is nothing so special about Asian philanthropic capital versus the rest of the world, except that it's probably the only pot that is growing because of the underlying economies. Two, that it's still more flexible and moldable than other forms of philanthropic capital from other geographies because it is still young. So these are the two silver linings against a not so encouraging immediate or even medium-term future. And below, let me explain why the challenges are multiple, complex, and sometimes even seems insurmountable. One, when people think about big philanthropies in contrast to SMEs and that collective spirit of camaraderie, you probably don't realize that it's still a drop in the ocean. And when you were talking about climate change, and Andy reminded us that we shouldn't be bound by the dichotomy of climate mitigation versus adaptation. And while that is laudable, when you are talking about climate mitigation, you are necessarily going to have to talk about energy. And energy is geopolitical in nature. We just witnessed an almost James Bond-like movie, except that it wasn't a movie in a certain Latin American country. That was about energy. That was not about drugs, or for that matter, climate change. So when you are talking about energy, the amount of money that you need to move to even let there be a flicker on the dial, it's not something that philanthropies can, or in fact should, get into. And then secondly, when you are thinking about philanthropic capital, because in the overall scheme of things, they are indeed a drop in the ocean, you need to use that kind of philanthropic capital well and leverage it to make it, number one, catalytic, two, experimental or innovative, and three, ultimately accountable and responsible for delivering impact in a leveraged or synergistic way. And that is tough. That is really tough, because it takes a lot of energy and imagination to try and craft philanthropic dollars and get it to the right places. Now, when you also then think about, well, you know what, why don't we then use philanthropic capital and leverage private capital? Now, there, the multiplier effect is, of course, much more powerful. But we've also witnessed in the last 2-3 years in particular, a retrenchment, almost to the point that it now is a dirty word not to be uttered, about ESG impact investing. The world did try to go that way, but even the world's largest and most powerful hedge fund has completely done a 180 on that kind of leverage. So then you have to think, well, if the world has tried that path, how should we proceed next? where should we steer the ship? And remember, when you're talking about leveraging private capital, whether it's in the public markets or in the private equity markets, there is no geography. The same smart money will be going after the greatest gains, whether it's financial return on investment or social return on investment. There is no borders. And so, therefore, there is why I said no special distinction. There is no radioactive dye that actually tags Asian philanthropic dollars versus the rest of the world. So, having sort of done this realpolitik or real geopolitic analysis, let me just end by saying I still think there is hope. Not only because there is compassion, not only because there is the collective potential of many, many small players coming together and heading in the right direction, but most of all, I still believe that the need and the evidence of the counterfactual is going to become more and more real every year that clicks along as we head towards breaching not just the 1.5 degree barrier, but perhaps even the 2 degree barrier, despite what Andy more hopefully suggested. And as you do that, you will be living through many of those real consequences, and it only takes a couple of degrees of connection for you to perhaps feel in your own gut that something needs to change. And let me just finally say, if you haven't been to the Pacific, which is probably the world's most vulnerable to climate change, don't just go to Fiji, but go to all of the islands there, and there you will learn to appreciate not just the touristy side of things, but what people who live in the PICs actually experience day after day, generation after generation. With that, thank you again, Tuba.
Thanks, Gabriel. So see, I promise you, better questions may not be a response at the end of these sessions, but please go to our parallel sections after this. This is a doorway to further conversations. With that, please join me to thank our panelists for today, and thank you for your attention. One housekeeping message, there will be a QR code on the screen right now. For evaluation of sessions, please use your phone, scan it, and let us know, how to improve next year. And stay tuned. What you mentioned, Gabriel, private sector, energy. Next year, we will talk commercial determinants of health. And a lot of this will be the key topic to PMAC. Thanks again.